Despite the rise of knightly cavalry in the 11th century, infantry played an important role throughout the Middle Ages on both the battlefield and in sieges. For the 14th century onwards, there was a rise in the prominence of infantry forces, sometimes referred to as an infantry revolution. Cost and recruitment, the growth of infantry. The rising costs of war in the medieval period, the mounted warrior held sway for an extended time, typically heavily armored, well-motivated and mounted on powerful, specially bred horses. The mounted knight represented a formidable force, which was used to effect against more lightly armored troops, since only the noble classes could afford the expense of knightly warfare. The supremacy of the mounted cavalryman was associated with the hierarchical structure of medieval times, particularly feudalism. As the period progressed, however, the dominance of the cavalry elite began to slowly break down. The Black Death in the 14th century swept through Europe, devastating the population and resulting in serious manpower shortages. This encouraged more economical use of available manpower, and the infantryman was much cheaper to outfit and maintain than the aristocratic knight. The Crusade era also saw a rise in the importance of infantry, and required large numbers of men and material to be organized for distant battlefields. Such expeditions were part of the growing number of sieges, disputes and campaigns throughout the 13th and 14th centuries that greatly increased the cost of warfare for medieval regimes. The relative inexpensiveness of the infantryman, combined with a shortage of manpower, provided incentives for expanding the use. Recruitment. The most common infantry throughout the early medieval period were peasants and commoners who were obliged to fight for the local lord. Due to the place in the feudal system, they were always unarmored or lightly armored and fought either with simple agricultural or hunting tools such as axes and long knives, or with the spear and shield. In most circumstances they were expected to bring and maintain their own equipment. At few times they were outfitted by the lord or king they fought for. These men were essentially conscripts, and as such the discipline, morale and fighting ability varied greatly. Generally, those fighting to protect the homeland were far more motivated than those fighting abroad. As the medieval period progressed, however, this pattern began to change under the pressure of constant warfare. The growth of urban centers opened up new sources of infantry recruits, including men with actual skills with arms. By the 11th century, much of the infantry fighting was conducted by middle-class freemen, who were expected to have a certain standard of equipment, often including a leather or iron helmet and an axe, long knife or sword. Peasants were reduced to the role of archers and skirmishers, providing missile cover for the heavy infantry and cavalry. The later medieval period also saw the expansion of mercenary forces, unbound to any medieval lord. The Swiss pikeman, the German Landsknecht, and the Italian condottiere are three of the best-known examples of this new class of fighting man. The expanded campaigns, castle building and sieges of the era also saw greater use of household troops, often bodyguards of the elite, with a variety of useful skills. These were cheaper to recruit and maintain than knights with all the trappings. Siege warfare in particular required large bodies of troops in the field for extended periods of time, including numerous specialists. All this added up to make the early days of peasant levies unsustainable. As more kings and lords turned to infantry, their opponents had to keep pace, leading to additional increases in foot troops. To obtain the best fighting men, elites had to make provision for the regular payment and supply. As one history of medieval warfare notes, the rising importance of foot troops, then, brought not only the opportunity but also the need to expand armies substantially. Then as early as the late 13th century, we can observe Edward I campaigning at the head of armies incorporating tens of thousands of paid archers and spearmen. This represented a major change in approaches to recruitment, organization, and above all pay. Organization and deployment. Organization. The importance of good order was well understood in medieval warfare. Two great evils can follow from a disordered formation. One is that enemies can easily break into it. The other is that the formations may be so compressed that they cannot fight. Thus it is important to keep the formation in ranks and tight and joined together like a wall. Militia forces were often organized by guilds or districts, with their own officers and banners. Swiss muster rolls show officers and standard bearers being appointed, and men being assigned to particular positions in the formation. Various accounts show that it was the role of commanders to make sure the men knew the position in the formation, knew which banners they fought under and who stood around them. Infantry formations. Philippe Contamine identifies three basic infantry formations in the Middle Ages: the wall, the circle, a crescent, and the deep solid formation, either rectangular or triangular. The wall linear formations existed throughout the medieval period. In the early Middle Ages, infantry used the shield wall, a formation where shields were held edge to edge or overlapped. Backlines persisted beyond the widespread abandonment of shields in the later Middle Ages. Lines could vary in depth from 4 to 16 deep and were drawn up tightly packed. The circle, this formation, called the crown by J.F. Verbruggen, was used by infantry to form an all-round defense against cavalry. It is recorded as having been used by Flemings, Swiss, Scots and Scandinavians. Deep formations, deep columns, were favored by the Swiss. A reconstruction of the deployment of Zurich forces in 1443 gives a formation 56 men wide by 20 deep, the formation having a width of 168 feet, and a depth of 140 feet. The Swiss main formation at the Battle of Morat consisted of 10,000 men, the outer four ranks being made up of pikemen, the inner ranks of halberdiers, the force having an estimated area of 60 meters by 60 meters. Triangular formations were also used, this sometimes being described as in the manner of a shield. Wedge formations were used by the Vikings under the name of a swine wedge. The Swiss also sometimes used a keel, a wedge of pikes to lead the columns. The nature of infantry combat. Infantry versus cavalry. Tactically, there were only two ways for infantry to beat cavalry in an open field battle: firepower and mass. Firepower could be provided by swarms of missiles. Mass could be provided by tightly packed phalanx of men. Such tactics were long established. The Romans used missile troops such as slingers, and the corps infantry learned to deal with swarming enemy cavalrymen by forming a hollow square fenced with a solid hedge of iron pillar. Alexander the Great combined both methods in his clashes with the Asiatic horsemen of Persia and India, screening his central infantry phalanx with slingers, archers and javelin men, before unleashing his cavalry against the enemy. Both mass and firepower could be aided by a good tactical position, such as on a hill or on rough terrain, where enemy cavalry would have trouble maneuvering. These ancient lessons were relearned in the medieval period, in the Crusades, in the continued operations of forces like the Flemish footmen and particularly the Swiss pikemen and the English longbowmen. The Crusades offer an illustration indication of the growing recognition of the need for infantry against the mounted Islamic foes of European armies. Infantry forces were of vital importance. Archers, for example, were essential in holding the fast-moving Muslim cavalry at bay, suppressing their firepower, and allowing the armored knights to mount successful counterattacks. Pikemen were important in screening the flanks of the Christian forces, always vulnerable to assault by the Turkish horsemen. Against Saladin's light cavalry at Jaffa during the Crusades, Richard of England drew up a line of spearmen, kneeling on the ground with spear planted in front, forming an effectual hedge of steel against the charging enemy horsemen. Behind the spear wall, crossbowmen stood ready, with assistants helping to reload. The Muslim armies attacked, but the combined firepower of the archers and the steadiness of the wall of spears held. Once the Muslims pulled back, Richard ordered his armored knights forward, and Saladin withdrew. At the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, the determined Flemish infantry staked out a good position on advantageous ground and stood firm against the cavalry charge of the French nobles, using the pikes and wooden godendog, a combination spear and club. The French charge was stopped and the Flemish infantry then moved forward to liquidate the opposition. At Bannockburn, the Scottish fighters dug numerous pits of foil. The English cavalry blunted the English advance, then counter-attacked with the pike army to soundly defeat their opponents. These and other examples illustrate the importance of trained infantry, but the dominance of the footmen did not come overnight. Both cavalrymen and infantrymen continued to operate for long periods side by side throughout the medieval period. Infantry versus infantry. The essential elements of success in infantry combat were seen as good order and a tight formation, not impetus. During the 100 Years' War, it was considered disadvantageous for infantry to be forced to attack. If infantry were forced to advance to the attack, it should be at a slow, steady pace and without turning. The actual mechanics of impact are not, however, fully understood. In his reconstruction of the infantry fight at Agincourt, John Keegan describes the French as running to contact over the final yards but the English stepping back to wrong-foot them. The English gave back at spear's length, leaving the two bodies spear fencing at a distance of 10 to 15 feet. This idea of a space between the battle lines in which combat takes place also features in some reconstructions of shield wall combat. Others see the clash of shield walls as involving physical impact of one line with the other, while it was known for a poorly arrayed line to disintegrate on contact with the enemy. It was more usual for a static battle to ensue and last for some time. Combat was not constant, the two sides parting to rest and reorganize. This could happen several times during a combat. When it wasn't possible, an infantry force could become compressed and disordered with disastrous consequences, as happened at Agincourt and West Rosabeek. The role of archery. The traditional role of archery on the medieval battlefield was to begin the action, advancing in front of the main body of the army, as occurred at the Battle of Hastings. This continued to be a standard tactic, particularly in the absence of enemy cavalry. The Swiss crossbowmen and handgunners of the 15th century were notable for their aggressive skirmishing in advance of the main army, as at Morat, to protect archers, particularly crossbowmen, against enemy archers. They were often deployed behind men with large shields, called pavises. This technique is first noted during the Crusades in the 12th century, for example at Jaffa, but was particularly common in Italy in the later Middle Ages. The crossbow began to replace the standard bow throughout Europe in the 12th century. In England and Wales, the longbow, and in Iberian Peninsula the recurved bow continued in use to the end of the period. Christian Spain owed the use of composite bows and mounted archery using Parthian shots to its long exposure to Islamic military techniques during the Reconquista. Later in the Middle Ages, massed archery techniques were developed. English and Welsh longbowmen in particular were famed for the volume and accuracy of the shooting, to which cavalry and poorly armoured infantry were particularly vulnerable. The role of infantry in sieges. A large number of sieges during the medieval era called for huge numbers of infantry in the field, both in defense and in attack. Aside from labor units to construct defensive or offensive works, several specialists were deployed such as artillerymen, engineers and miners. Strongly fortified castles were hard to overcome. The simplest, most effective method was blockade and starvation. Artillery in the form of catapults, siege engines and later gunpowder weapons played an important role in reducing fortified positions. Mining beneath walls, shoring up the tunnel then collapsing it was also used. Defenders employed counter-tactics using their own artillery, missile weapons, and counter-mines against attacking forces. Against sieges, cavalrymen were not as valuable as footmen, and a large number of such troops was also used in the construction of fortifications. Free mercenary forces such as the condottieri generally attempted to defeat the foes in open field battle or maneuver, but also participated in sieges, adding to the specialist ranks that bolstered the growing dominance of infantry.